Turn with me again to that passage from which we read just a few moments ago in Mark's Gospel. And I'll read just a few verses that cover the account of Jesus dealing with this blind man again. Then Jesus, came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. When he had spit on his eyes and put his hands on him, he asked him if he saw anything. And he looked up and said, I see men like trees walking. Then he put his hands on his eyes again and made him look up. And he was restored and saw everyone clearly. Then he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town, nor tell anyone in the town. Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the Guinness Book of Records. I know many of the records that are contained within it. But let me just bring you one of them. Do you know what the greatest crane in the world is? Well, before you all jump with an answer, I'll give it to you. The greatest crane in the world is found in China, and it can lift over 20,000 tons. That's just around 11,700 cars in one go. Of course, cranes are not a modern invention. You could look back into ancient times, into ancient Greece, Egypt, and see the use of cranes in these countries and at these times and in these societies. Of course, the greatest crane of all time, was found in Israel. And we see it operating here in Mark chapter 8. Jesus Christ lifting lives from darkness to light, from despair to hope, from death to life. How did he do it? Well, we'll see as we look at the way in which he dealt with this blind man. I'd like to look at these verses with you this morning under three simple headings. Jesus gave this man undivided attention, individual treatment, and then thirdly, life-changing love. Undivided attention, individual treatment, then thirdly, life-changing love. First of all, let's see Jesus giving this man his undivided attention. This man comes to Jesus in a pitiful condition. He's physically blind, of course. We see that explicitly in the passage, but emotionally, as we read of him and the way Jesus has to deal with him, he's a man who seems somehow detached, dejected, almost shut down within himself. He has to be brought here into the presence of Jesus. He doesn't speak, he doesn't respond, he doesn't react. He almost shuffles into the presence of Jesus. Spiritually, there's no life. Here he is in the presence of the Son of God. There's no response. He's a sinner in a world under curse. What did Jesus do with him? Well, after this man is brought to Jesus, we see the first thing that Jesus does is to take hold of him. He takes hold of him. Jesus gave him his undivided attention by taking hold of him. We see him taking hold of this man's hand. A lovely picture there is Jesus walking out of Bethsaida, taking this man from his friends by the hand, and they walk out together. The picture there really is a little more robust than we might initially think. Jesus takes his hand, yes, but there's a sense in which The word that's used there gives us the picture of Jesus grasping his hand, taking hold of his hand. This man isn't going to come unless Jesus takes hold of him. That's the condition in which he's in. This isn't just a gentle stroll or walk in the park. Jesus is taking him, taking hold of him. And he leads him out by the hand, out of the town, away from any unwanted attention or distraction, all the time giving him this tangible sense of his presence, letting him know by touch that his attention was focused on him. Jesus with him, holding onto him, taking hold of him. Undivided attention. But then when they arrive just outside Bethsaida, Jesus then gives him individual treatment. Having led this man outside of the town, Jesus addresses his need in a very individual way in order to reach him. He uses two stages here, doesn't he? See how Jesus healed this man. Why does he do it like this? Well, Jesus dealt with individuals, didn't he? We see another blind man in Mark chapter 10, Bartimaeus. Very different character. And Jesus deals with him in a very different way. He's faced with this man. He deals with him in a way that meets his need. He spits on his face. He puts his hands on his eyes, stands back, asks him if he sees anything. Of course, the man sees something. And Jesus puts his hands on his eyes again, then stands back, and the man sees clearly. Two stages. Why does he do that? Well, perhaps because of the man's condition. He was preparing this man for what was going to happen. He spits on his eyes as if to say, get ready, I'm going to open your eyes. And then, as if it would be too much for him to have a sudden restoration, he does it gradually. That may be true. But I believe there's also something more here. He uses two stages in this healing, but he has one aim. Jesus knows that this man's need is more than physical sight. It is as if he is doing what he does to take hold of his life, to reach down into his being and to shout, look at me, look to me. He's not uninterested with the man's blindness, of course. He feels for him. But he has his priority. The healing of his eyes is important, but in some sense, secondary. This man needs life in his soul. Only Jesus can give him that. Undivided attention, individual treatment. Then we see the reality of life-changing love. This man comes to Jesus as a sinner, and he feels the reality of his power, the power of Jesus, the power of Christ. Jesus takes hold of this man with human hands, but as the Son of God, he reaches into his very being and brings life. See the reality of that here. So we see the power of Christ changing this man. He came into the presence of Jesus. Though others were talking around him, he didn't seem to be able to listen. Now he listens to Jesus and responds. There were no words in his mouth. Now he speaks. And we see in the midst of this miracle how he looks up. That might seem a small thing. As we see this man coming into the presence of Jesus, he comes, as we read in Psalm 146, as someone who is bowed down. He probably hasn't looked up for years. Lost within himself, dejected, despairing. Jesus lifts his head as he reaches down into his heart and gives him life. And now he wants to tell. Why else does Jesus direct him away from the town and say, do not go and tell in the town? He sends him home, presumably allowing him to tell any who were in his house or his neighbors. There's change in this man's life. Of course, his eyes open and he sees everyone. After the second time Jesus removes his hands, he sees everyone clearly. But of course, the first one he sees is Jesus, the face of Jesus. Blessed restoration. How is it possible that Jesus was able to change this man's life, lift this man's life, deal with this man's sin, his basic issue, as well as heal his eyes and give him physical sight and spiritual sight? How was he able to do it? Well, Jesus has the power to forgive sin because, of course, he gave his life to deal with sin. And we can see something of that here in this passage, I believe. Because as this man comes to Jesus, he experiences the power of Jesus, but as Jesus deals with him, he's displaying something of his own passion and what it would mean for him to deal with this man's sin. Look a little closer at how Jesus deals with this man here. See what's going on. This miracle, of course, is unique to Mark's gospel. I believe that is the case because it was of particular importance and particularly memorable for Peter, who was present at this miracle, of course, because Peter, as most are agreed, is the source of Mark's gospel. And as we look at the verses here that follow, that I read earlier on, we can see that Jesus moves on from Bethsaida and this man, and immediately he's asking questions. Who do the people say I am? Of course, there are various answers, and then Peter gives this wonderful statement: you are the Christ, Son of the living God. And we're told then that Jesus, from that point, began to teach them the Son of Man must suffer at the hands of men, the third day rise from the dead. He began to speak to them verbally about what would happen to him. Of course, they didn't understand, and we see Peter's response and reaction here. But Peter, perhaps in retrospect now, is included in this miracle in Mark's account because of the significance it has for him in light of this. Jesus begins to verbally share of what will happen to him here for the first time in these verses. But in this miracle that comes immediately before, it seems that Jesus is almost acting out a prophecy pointing forward to what it would take for him to deal with this man's sin. Look at it again. Jesus takes hold of this man. He takes him out away from his friends. And when they get to where Jesus wants him to be, what does he do? He spits into his face. He lays his hands on his head, this blind man. And he says to him, what do you see? And of course, when he removes his hands, Jesus brings forth life. And this man is almost resurrected. Does that raise an echo of something with you? Is there something familiar in that for you? There was, I believe, for Peter in retrospect. Listen to these words further on in Mark's Gospel. After Jesus had been led away from his friends, we are told, then some began to spit on him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their hands and to say to him, prophesy, what do you see? And the officers struck him with the palms of their hands. Jesus is pointing forward here, isn't he? Jesus is almost using this man to enact a prophecy of what it will take for him to deal with this man's sin before his disciples as they look on. He lifts this life by being lifted up himself as he looks forward to the cross. And then, of course, he sends this man home with life in his heart and a message to share with those who were there. Now, what can we learn from the way Jesus dealt with this man? I have to say I've struggled in application this week. I've gone from one thing to another. Of course, there are a number of things we could say. Perhaps we could focus on the fact that Jesus answers prayer. This man didn't come, did he, to Jesus on his own? He was brought. When they came, they begged Jesus. And the working out of this miracle, we can see the reality of Jesus answering their prayer, and more than answering their prayer in the life of this man. That's an application, isn't it? Or perhaps, in light of what I've just said, we could look at the fact that Jesus uses the weak things of this world. He takes this man who's on the edge and the margins of society, resigned almost to his just barely existing. He takes him, he changes him, and as he changes him, so he uses him in the life of his disciples, though they didn't know it at that time, they would, particularly Peter, who witnessed that scene, of course, in the courtyard of the high priest. We could look at that, couldn't we? However, I feel particularly constrained this morning to focus on the big thing here. You may not be a believer in Jesus Christ this morning. You may have been meeting in the church here, physically in the building, or here now on Zoom, and may have been meeting with the fellowship for many years. Perhaps you grew up in the church, but never really believed in the gospel of your parents. Perhaps you've made a profession of faith and outwardly are still seeking to maintain that, but you know that really it's in the past. This is a word for you. This is a word for you. There are three things I'd like to share briefly as we come to a close this morning. The first is this: Jesus comes to you. He comes to you. We see these friends bringing this man to Jesus. But as this account opens, of course, we see that it's Jesus who comes to them. In my version, it reads, then he came to Bethsaida. In the NIV, it reads that, and then they came to Bethsaida, the same in effect, really. Jesus came to him. He knew this blind man was there. And as they came to Bethsaida, Jesus came knowing that this man needed his help. And he came to him. You are probably at home this morning. Perhaps if you're on YouTube, some days after this has been recorded, then you may be on your break in work. You may be a key worker on the front line, perhaps. You may be listening while out for your daily exercise. You may be in your car. You may be somewhere else in Wales or the UK or even the world. Wherever you are, know this: Jesus comes for you. Jesus comes for you. Why? Well, the second thing is this, as we look at this passage and the way he dealt with this blind man. Jesus comes for you. Jesus cares for you. He cares for you. What are your circumstances right now? Are you in the midst of fear, anxiety, uncertainty, illness, weakness, pain, loneliness, weariness, grief, sorrow, or disappointment? Jesus cares for you in the midst of it. See how he dealt with this man. Robust, but yet so tender and caring. See how he dealt with others in the gospel accounts. Mark in chapter 5 speaks of an anxious father, a chronically ill woman, a dying child. Jesus deals with them with equal care and attention and love. He comes across a widow walking out of the city of Nain in Luke chapter 7. We are told her only son had died. We are told he was moved with compassion. In Mark chapter 6, we see Jesus looking at the crowds. He is moved again with compassion as he sees them, sheep without a shepherd. Jesus cares for you. Do you think he's dispassionate when thousands lie in a hospital bed struggling with COVID? He looks at the multitude. He's moved with compassion. Do you think he's dispassionate when workers on the front line are exhausted, hardly able to do another shift, feeling the fear of catching COVID? He's moved with compassion. He cares for you. Come to him with your circumstances. Come to him with your fears, your anxieties, your uncertainties. He is merciful and kind. Of course, he's already blessed you in so very many ways. But as you come, know this. As with this man, his priority is your soul. As he comes with his care, he comes with his call. Jesus comes for you. He comes, he cares for you. He calls for you. In all your varied needs and concerns, there is a greater one. And Jesus calls you in the midst of whatever you face today to realize it. What is it? It was this man's basic problem: sin. The Bible tells us that all have sinned, all have turned against God, all have rebelled, and all, as a result, have fallen short of his standard, and as such deserve death and judgment. And that all included this blind man and the disciples and the friends of this blind man. That all includes me, and it includes you. Here with us this morning, or wherever you are, sometime in the future. That's why, like this man, you need Jesus. How can he help? You may have read or be familiar with a well-known story written by John Bunyan called The Pilgrim's Progress. There's a scene where a pilgrim, he's left home on his way to Celestial City, and he carries this weight on his back. It represents his sin, his failure. And he comes to a hill. And on top of the hill, he sees 3 trees that he thinks are trees. And as he gets closer, he realizes the trees are in fact crosses. As he comes to the crosses, he sees in the middle cross, on top of it, there is an inscription. It says, "The King of the Jews." The cross is blood-stained and there are twisted nails sticking in it. He looks again at the inscription and he sees it changes. It becomes the light of the world. And no, then it becomes the way, the truth, and the life. And then it becomes the door. And as he thinks on these things, so suddenly the pack on his back falls, rolls down the hill and disappears, and he's free of it, free of his sin. How did it happen? Well, because the one who died on that cross took it from him. Jesus came into this man's life and he was weighed down with sin. Jesus took the weight of this man's sin and he lifted it onto himself. And he lifts the weight of each of his people. In heaven, there will be a multitude that cannot be numbered. Each one carried the weight of their sin in their lives. Jesus lifted each one and it was loaded onto him. Many of us are believers here this morning. Just think back on your lives. Each sin you can remember you've committed was loaded onto Jesus. As Jesus dealt with this man and reached into his life, he could see this man's life and all that he'd done. And as he forgave his sin, he knew he would have to bear each one. If you were with us on Tuesday in the prayer meeting, we looked at the dying criminal on the cross and how there on the cross this man was forgiven. This man's life, how does he assess it? He says to his fellow criminal on the other cross, "We deserve this. They deserve crucifixion. What a horrible execution." Yet he says in his assessment of himself, "My life deserves crucifixion." What a life had he lived. And yet Jesus, as he turns to him and gives him forgiveness and life, on that cross, on that day, that man's sin, every one is laid upon him. And the sin of all his people, as he's plunged into darkness, and the wrath of God is poured out upon him as he endures the penalty, dies the death, takes the hell and judgment of all who will come to trust in him. He bears it. This morning, Jesus comes for you. He cares for you. Jesus calls for you. He takes your hand. Will you go with him? He lays his hands on you and calls for you. Look to me. Look to me. Have you done that? This man could look into the face of Jesus and feel his touch on his life. Jesus was there physically. He could look at him physically. How do you do that today? If Jesus called you to look to him, how do you look to him? Well, hearing his word now, as he's presented before you, look to him. If you have a Bible, open your Bible, read again of this blind man and other situations where you see Jesus. Perhaps you've heard of him as a child. You may have grown up through Sunday school, perhaps gone to a church school, somewhere heard of Jesus. Perhaps you have a Gideon Bible somewhere in your house. Open it. Read it. Look to Jesus. He calls you. I don't often, when I'm preaching, give much personal testimony, but I think at this point it might be helpful. As a young man, yes, I had some church background, a little bit of Sunday school perhaps. I had a wonderful childhood. My parents, though, weren't churchgoers. I went to a church school. So I had some contact with the scriptures, but it all started, I believe, for me, as I opened the pages of the book written by C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and I longed to be in Narnia. I longed to see the face of the lion, Aslan. Well, I put it aside and lived my life for a number of years. And it was when really, in some ways, in my life, I was on the crest of a wave. And yet, there was something not quite right. I was given a New Testament by the Gideons in school. But I opened the pages. But I turned to the Gospels. And there in the Gospels, I saw the face of the Lion of the tribe of Judah, Jesus Christ himself. And he came for me. And I knew he cared for me. And he called for me and he reached into my life and forgave my sin and gave me hope and new direction. He can do it for you this morning. Or whatever time of day you were listening to this message, he can do it for you. It doesn't matter who you are, what your background is. It doesn't matter what state your life is in. He will reach into your very being. He will lift your heart. He will forgive your sin. He will give you life forevermore if you trust in him. Of course, difficult circumstances may still remain. Problems may still be before us. But from that point on, he will be with you. Jesus sent this man away, back to his home. But this man, when he went away, took Jesus with him in his heart. He will be with you in life, and you will be safe and secure forevermore. My mother-in-law, Maya Davis, many of you will know, she was a previous pastor's wife here in the church some years ago. But in the family circle, she had a nickname amongst them. It was the Crane. When they had problems and they felt a bit low or depressed or struggling, they would go to their mother and she would lift them up. She would lift them up. If there was a problem, they would say, go to the crane. Well, in an infinitely greater way, as wonderful as that was, in an infinitely greater way, Jesus lifts sinners to life and salvation as he lifted you. Love lifted me when nothing else could help. Love lifted me as love lifted you. The love of Christ, his undivided attention, his individual treatment, his life-changing power, his life-changing love. Well, Jesus lifted this man, gave him his sight, restored his soul, sent him home. What happened to him from that day on? Well, we don't know really, do we? The circumstances of his life. Presumably he continued to live outside Bethsaida, perhaps with his family. We don't know. Except that one day he closed the eyes that Jesus healed and found himself again hand in hand with the King. And as we come to close this morning, we're going to sing a hymn. I don't think we've sung it before. It's quite an easy tune, but I want to sing it because part of it particularly perhaps expresses how this man would have felt as he left Jesus, made for his home, and how there in the quietness of his home dwelt upon the reality of what had happened to him. From a man who was dejected, from a man who was in despair, from a man who was resigned, without hope and without God in the world, to a man who could then say to himself, come, rejoice now, O my soul, for his love is my reward. Fear is gone and hope is sure. Christ is mine forevermore. Well, shall we make that hymn, that song, our own as we sing it together?